Welcome to Lesson Learned, the official podcast of the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment Department in Midwestern Intermediate Unit 4. I'm your host, Shannon Smith, and today we're diving into empowering educators, a whole school approach to mental health. Welcome back to our series on school climate. We'll continue to take on the hard truths, complex questions, and bold ideas shaping school climate today. I'm joined once again in the studio by Dr. Melissa Nelson, our K-12 safety and security expert, and Dr. Susan Tarasevich, our school climate and staff expert. In this episode, we're getting real about something that's impacting every school every day. That's student mental health. We're not just talking about surface level SEL or isolated crisis moments. We're digging into what prevention, intervention, and sustained support really looks like. Together, we'll explore the warning signs of suicide and violence, how to spot them, how to act, and most importantly, how to build schools where students feel seen, supported, and safe. So whether you're an educator, administrator, counselor, or campus security, this episode is for you. Let's talk prevention with purpose, intervention with heart, and support that actually works. Melissa and Susan, thank you once again for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure to be back with you today, again, Shannon, to talk about two topics that are so near and dear to my heart, violence and suicide prevention. So happy to be here with you.
And once again, I am thrilled to be back. Our past podcasts have really caused me to think more deeply about that connection between mental health teams and promotion, as well as intervention, and its link with positive school climate and safety. So it's always a pleasure to talk with like-minded people. I learned so much.
Well, thank you both. So to kick things off today, when people talk about a whole school approach to mental health, what does that actually look like in a real school? And where do you think most schools are still missing the mark?
Well, just as with everything, it has to be leadership driven. And I think prioritizing mental health, not just of the students, but also of the staff, families, and community is paramount. So that means writing it down in school improvement plans, in all the policies that can direct procedures and guidelines and best practices, and in our budgets.
And to tie together some of the previous conversations we've had in other podcasts, when we think about a whole school approach to violence and suicide prevention and in work around supporting students and their mental health needs, I really think about the culture and climate of the school. And when you think about culture and a whole school approach to those very crucial areas, it has to be understood by everyone, from the students who are in our schools, to the families of those students, to, as Susan said, the leadership groups, to everyone in the ancillary support roles, to the teachers in the classroom, that it takes everyone to really engage in good awareness and prevention in these areas. It takes everyone. No one person can take on, addressing any of these areas by themselves.
I couldn't agree more. Yes, we need to do good professional development with our staff so that they know what to look for, how to prevent. And we'll get into that a little later. But I guess one thing I really want to hit on too is having good support systems in place, like a student assistance program. People might not know this, but SAP in Pennsylvania is mandated. Now, parents and students don't have to participate, but we as school professionals need to have them available. And so there have to be really clear pathways for students who need more targeted mental health supports. I want to see that the SAP team works closely with county-based child and adolescent behavioral health services, that they have the auspices of a highly trained SAP liaison who can provide them with technical assistance, but are also that source of screening and or assessment and acting as the link with that larger system of care in the community.
Well, and I think over the past 2 decades, there definitely has been efforts placed on educating the whole student. And if we consider what we have seen post-pandemic, this emphasis on supporting students, in particular, what we can do to help support their mental health, with focusing on past traumas, coping, resiliency. But while we're focusing on supporting the students, why is it just as important to focus on giving educators and staff the tools and training that they need, not only to support their students and that they see in their classrooms, but to support their own mental health needs?
What a great question. To think about asking our faculty and our staff, our ancillary staff, anybody who's in a school to come into a building every day and be totally focused and locked in on supporting students without addressing at all that what the adults that are coming into the building might be bringing themselves is definitely a misstep that I think schools have really been working very hard to address, which is to center educators a bit more in these conversations, starting with them of how is your mental health? How can we best support your mental health? Some people use terms like work-life balance being a little bit better, even though that can be really difficult because certainly educators work very much around the clock at this point. Or it might be, making sure that everyone in a school has access to good mental health support services through employee assistant programs that are available to them. But by focusing specifically on all of the adults in the school and helping them be the best version of themselves allows them to be more both cognitively and emotionally available to teach them more about what the mental health needs are of the children that they're serving. So, Susan made such a good point when she started addressing professional development in this area. And when I think about the types of professional development that I recommend for schools to use to help in this area, I do always mention that before they get to teaching about mental health supports and issues and what to recognize and be aware of and intervene with children, that they really should start first with at least centering the adults a bit and helping them recognize areas they might be struggling in and supports for them.
Without question. And as we were talking, I couldn't help but think about a friend of mine who is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's in charge of social workers in a very large district. And one of the things that she wants to do when she retires is be a clinician who has an office in the school, and her whole job would be seeing staff members who are affected by trauma, who want to come in and talk about stressors at home, how to manage burnout, and those kinds of things. And, we do that for kids. How come we're not doing it for staff? And she'll take insurance, right?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I said we do it for kids. How come we don't think to do that for staff?
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'd love to meet your friend. I do know that work is going on at the Western Pennsylvania School for Blind Children, and it came out of that very kind of conversations that we're having now is how do we get to the work of caring for children if we don't first care for the caretakers. And so Dr. Heidi Ondak, the superintendent who's there, brought on Dr. Toya Jones from the University of Pittsburgh, and who also has her own practice as a licensed clinical social worker, to be on site at the Western Pennsylvania School for Blind Children to specifically help and focus on the needs of all of the adults in the building. So it's definitely a model that I'm hoping that between what's happening there and what your friend would like to do is something that catches on.
I do too. I do too. And I think, when we talk about where most schools are missing the mark, I was in a high school a few weeks ago where the staff, I don't know if you want to call it burnout or compassion fatigue, was so pronounced. Administrators are complaining the staff doesn't want to do anything extra, and the staff are complaining that they don't feel cared about. And I think when teachers are feeling that way, it filters down to the students. And there's a lot of research out there. They've measured cortisol levels in kids and in staff members that are, really manifesting signs of compassion fatigue. And the kids feel it. So that's an area, I think, where staff, where schools really need to pay attention.
I was at a conference this past winter, and teacher burnout was very much a reoccurring theme that I saw, whether it was through keynote speakers or even in some of the breakout sessions that they offered. And just in my own research, I couldn't help but sit there and think, I know I was taking a ton of notes, just different areas that I wanted to explore. And I couldn't help but thinking, why are we focusing on the burnout instead of focusing on the prevention? And I think so many times there's so much going on within the system of a school that we do tend to take a reactionary approach. There are many things that we don't consider until after the event happens. So let's kind of dive into early prevention. And what does that really mean when we're trying to catch emotional distress before it turns into something more serious like self-harm or violence?
Well, I think early prevention in schools today is really about building systems where every student can feel seen, feel supported, and feel safe. And that's before they show up in the nurse's office or in crisis or lash out in a way that leads to suspension. So I think we want to proactively identify those students who are having challenges. We want to create environments that certainly lower the risk in the first place and have our multi-tiered systems of support. So if I go back to identifying students who are having behavioral challenges, one of the things that MTSS gives us, and I think it's so good, are universal screeners that are short surveys that a teacher completes on students. And it really helps us identify the internalizers, those kids who are really skilled at flying under the radar until there's a big crisis. Teachers, I think, are in the best position to identify early warning signals, withdrawal, irritability, drop in grades, those kinds of big red flags, and not see them as just bad behavior, but as red flags. And then in Pennsylvania especially, how do we make referrals to SAP for this? And I think early prevention means using SAP proactively. And what I mean by that is it's okay to refer a student, and the SAP team says, we think that a couple sessions with the school counselor would better serve this student. And so we'll come back in a week or two or three or four and see where things are. I think it's always better to refer, 9 out of 10 kids than risk losing the 10th.
And when we specifically think about early awareness, prevention, and intervention for children and adolescents who may be on a pathway to targeted violence, where they're thinking about taking a grievance that they might have and escalating that situation from grievance to an actual act of violence. Early awareness, prevention, and intervention really means using great behavioral threat assessment and management tools and frameworks to catch things and intervene early and intervene often, just like we do when we are concerned about students who have academic struggles. We want to be noticing these things as soon as possible before they become, as Susan said, a crisis. It's much easier and far more effective in a K-12 system, when we are intervening early and often, whether we're talking about academics or behaviors or a child on a pathway to violence or a child who maybe even be showing warning signs of suicide, far better for us to be noticing those things very early on than when they reach that crisis point, and our interventions look much different at that point.
And that ties in so well, Melissa, with, talking about our multi-tiered system of support. So many schools are relying heavily on that tier 3 one-on-one support with school counselors and outside therapists. And yet real early prevention means that we are investing more in the tier 1 school-wide SEL instruction through Second Step and Character Strong, that we're giving kids the opportunity to learn skills for regulating and managing feelings and behaviors. And then when we're doing those things well, it automatically reduces some of the more intensive supports that are needed. And I think the reason schools do that is, despite good intentions, a lot of the schools that I work with are still struggling because their counselors are overburdened. Schools that have 500-600 students to one counselor, when the American School Counseling Association says one for every 250. I think that's an investment that schools are making and finding that it pays off. I think disproportionate discipline, that we don't take time to really look at what our discipline data is telling us. Are we over-identifying our students of color, our LGBTQ plus students, our students with disabilities? Many times they're often punished as opposed to being supported. And that really ties into creating that environment that lowers risk in the first place through trauma-informed approaches and restorative practices and wellness centers or calming corners where kids can take breaks before a meltdown happens. They're very simple, but really powerful.
Susan, you mentioned having those cool down spaces for students. And I think in the districts that I have had the opportunity to experience their daily routines firsthand, I think some of the best things that I've seen are having like doodle desks or doodle corners in the elementary schools, and then working our way up into the middle school and high school, having Zen dens, or some of them are titling them SEL rooms. So if we think about this, funding is often such a barrier in terms of how we're supporting our students, how we're supporting the staff. So in efforts to distribute the load amongst the adults in the building, other than these doodle desks or Zen dens, what are some examples of systems or routines, maybe even like morning check-ins or advisory time or different classroom practices that can really help schools protect students' wellness without overcomplicating the system and also without creating additional funding burdens that might not be an option?
Oh, I love this question. And I'm going to give a very big blanketed statement to it. And I will give you some examples. And I know Susan's going to have a wonderful example. But any program, any system that's in a school that focuses time, energy, effort, thought into building wonderful, positive connections with students, it costs nothing. It costs absolutely nothing. And by the way, educators are wonderful at building positive relationships. There has been so much research done in this area about what are the best ways preventatively, proactively, through intervention to help children with everything from academic success to emotional and social success to lifting them up when they are having a mental health crisis. It really does come down to connections. And sometimes people hear that and say, oh, come on, it's got to be more complicated than that. It's actually not. This is one of those, I love to quote the Indigo Girls when they say the hardest to learn is the least complicated. This isn't a complicated answer. It really does come down to how people connect. So classroom procedures, making sure you're standing at the door every single time children are walking into a classroom, in between classes changing in a middle school or a high school, being out in the hallway, saying hello, intervening if if it seems like there's any kind of troubles going on within the classroom, making sure that people are sitting down and sitting beside children and leaning in and listening. Those are really, it really just does come down to positive connections. Susan, I can't wait to hear what your examples are.
Well, one of the best pieces of advice or strategy that I heard came from Dr. Eric Jensen, who did a lot of work on teaching with the brain in mind and, teaching students who grow up in poverty. And one of the things that he said, and I think that every educator can use this, especially those of you in the classroom, do something different every 7 minutes. And in short, that means you're always switching it up. It really helps kids with attention issues. It helps kids who have trauma issues. So, just structuring in short brain breaks, Go Noodle for elementary, Smiling Mind or Headspace for educators, box breathing, guided grounding. There are tons of wonderful brain breaks that can help us focus kids, that can help us calm, and there are brain breaks that can help us energize. I think building connections, so having classroom jobs or having check-in pals at the elementary level, giving kids those simple opportunities for those morning check-ins. They can be low tech, color-coded cards or check-in charts, or it can even be done digitally so that kids have some privacy. Those are some great things. I think for teachers who are having a hard time with a particular student, regardless of the issue, the 2x10 strategy has a good research base to it, or evidence base, let's say, and it's spending 2 minutes a day for 10 days, getting to know a student that you have a really hard time with. And I really do. I have seen that work beautifully. That doesn't cost anything. Also, I think the more opportunities we give students who tell us from their perspective what helps them, maybe mental health minutes, where we're actually building hope with inspirational quotes that might kick off a certain lesson, or maybe some mantra that we as a classroom or a class come up with that really does motivate us and capture our attention and mindset and harness our motivation. So those are just a few off the top of my head, but I do see things like this really, really helping.
I wish when I was in the classroom that I would have used the idea of taking brain breaks. I was in a high school setting, and I think about the days that there was always the conflicts that occur within the building. Working with teenagers, we know that typically there's always some kind of drama that is on the surface, but in addition to that, thinking of how the outlying community and events that were occurring were affecting the students that were in my classroom, and not just taking those students that maybe I needed to have a conversation with privately in the hallway to reach out to them, but just how many of my students would have just appreciated, when focus was lacking and they just couldn't get into whatever the assignment was that, or lesson that we were doing that day, just to take that break. And even, as a whole class, having that few minutes of mindfulness, having that few minute pause where everybody can re-energize themselves, specifically in a high school setting, because there's no recess for them to go burn off some energy, or to, maybe work through some of the things that, were really impacting their day, impacting their lives outside of school as well. And I think what, both of you have highlighted, just educators in general tend to have this natural ability to build rapport and relationships. And our educators have such a unique perspective because for many of them, our students might not feel comfortable reaching out to their immediate family or, an adult in their personal life that they might feel comfortable talking to. Maybe some of those adults aren't as attuned to, warning signs or language triggers that our teachers very much are. So if we can just take a second to get real, what are some of the warning signs of suicidal thinking or violent behavior that schools often miss?
Melissa, do you want to start?
Sure. I think a good place to start is actually to initially separate out warning signs of suicide and think about that specifically, and then warning signs that a student may be on a pathway to violence, targeted violence, that, as I mentioned earlier, starts with a particular grievance that leads to an act of aggression or violence. So let's start first with the area of suicide. And certainly, Susan, please jump in. I just thought for the purpose of this podcast, it would be helpful to separate those two out so that we can ultimately then talk about where there's overlap with the two. So I think when we look at what warning signs of suicide are, there are plenty of places that we can go online to learn about more. And as educators, there are wonderful resources that the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency have asked a group of subject matter experts to create a curriculum for the state about warning signs of suicide. People can find that kind of training at pak12sssstp.org/training. And Shannon will make sure that everybody who's listening to this podcast can access that too, because that was a real mouthful. But in general, when we think about warning signs of suicide, what we look at are, in general, things like students who are looking like they're struggling, they're starting to withdraw, they're starting to isolate. They might be writing letters of goodbye to people. They might be offering their prized belongings or possessions to people as a way to start to say goodbye. They may just really come right out and say, look, my life isn't worth living anymore. I'm going to engage in whatever it is that they're thinking about doing as far as the act they're thinking to complete a suicide. So we often see warning signs verbal communication. Sometimes it's nonverbal communication, like that isolating and shutting down. And many times now we see particularly adolescents engaging in using communication through social media, through text messaging, where they're coming right out and telling their friends or someone they love, or maybe they're on a platform, a gaming platform, or a social media app, or somewhere out there on the web, and they're communicating that in that place that they're hanging out. So those are a few of the warning signs that come top to mind. But I think, when people are listening to a podcast like this, it's a good place to listen to Susan and I start with some common warning signs, but it's not enough just to know maybe, our abbreviated list. It really is important to go out and be as dedicated to learning about warning signs of suicide and how they show up as we are dedicated to noticing when a student is struggling academically and all the ways we can intervene. And Susan, I gave my, my immediate response to that, but what are you thinking a little bit about ways to address warning signs of suicide? Because this is such an important area to discuss.
Well, first of all, I want to make people aware that educators in grades 6 through 12, I think, need to have 4 hours or 3 hours of suicide, 4 hours every 5 years. So not only do districts have to have a suicide prevention policy and procedure in place, and they need to post it on their website, teachers, educators in grades 6 through 12 need to have this training available. And as Melissa said, you can access that on the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. There's also a website called preventsuicidpa.org. I know that's a mouthful, but under resources, there are tons of free trainings available on preventing or developing prevention programs. There's an entire track for schools and educators so that, there are interactive simulations that are designed to prepare educators to identify. But getting right down to it, I think that good educators do two things. First thing they do is they are attuned to behaviors that are not typical for a student. Some of them are typical based on developmental level. So, for example, if I am noticing that a student is having mood swings, that's typical for an adolescent, especially as you consider the stress of body changes and new expectations academically and at home. Hormones and friendships are all, in that cauldron, if you will. But when I would tell an educator to be concerned is as you are watching these mood swings, are they extreme? Have they gone on for 2 weeks or longer? Are you seeing more isolation or more outbursts? And if you are concerned about a student who has written something, who has offhandedly said, I think I might be better off dead, if you are approached by a peer, a student who is worried about their friend, take that seriously. Those are not SAP referrals, my friends and colleagues. Those are crisis. And so taking the student to the counselor, to the nurse, to an administrator, so that somebody can put eyes on them and do a good, thorough risk assessment, I think makes a host of difference. It says a couple things. Number one, we are giving you an opportunity to open a window. You don't have to be in this by yourself. Sometimes that alone can shift some of the thinking. It's not enough, obviously, but it's really looking at kids are, testing limits developmentally in appropriate ways. But if you're starting to see any evidence of self-injury, or they're being particularly aggressive or taking risks that are threatening their health, welfare, and safety, or that of some others, then I think it's worth an investigation. Life and school and social lives are stressful. And many times kids will complain about, I'm just so stressed, I don't know what to do. But if you start to see that crossing over into deep despair, into panic attacks, into withdrawal, into giving things away that used to be prized possessions, I think you want to take action and treat that as a crisis, a potential crisis. Obviously, some of these more typical things can get referred to SAP, but I would rather educators err on the side of caution, take it to the counselor, because, those sudden changes, expressions of hopelessness or worthlessness, talking about death, those self-harm signs, extreme withdrawal, they're skipping lunch, they're avoiding peers, they're disengaged in class. When you say big drops in academic performance, or, for those of you who are teaching English and literature and do writing assignments, you have to monitor those things, because sometimes what's written in journals are very disconcerting. And you want to have somebody to check in with that. Even art teachers, if it doesn't sit with you, if they're doing self-portraits that are shocking and somewhat, they make you feel uneasy, it's always worth a check-in with that student. And I want classroom educators to remember, you do not have to be the expert in this stuff. You are there to be the person in the trenches to identify these things early. We know from years and years and decades of work that when we're able to identify mental health or behavioral health challenges early and get kids the appropriate and effective intervention early on, their outcomes are better. And so seeing it again through that preventive lens, maybe I'm going to be wrong about this. And in which case, that child may have some feelings about me, but my primary job is keeping kids safe. And so I think erring on the side of caution is always the best advice.
So that is a really big bucket, to think about when we think about knowing about suicide warning signs, how they might specifically show up in the classroom, ways we can approach supporting that. So now I'd like to shift over and talk about warning signs that a student may be thinking about targeted violence. And I want to just pause for a minute to explain what I mean by targeted violence. There is a difference between something we call reactive violence, which is maybe somebody who's emotionally dysregulated. They get really angry really quickly. It's happened to all of us. A lot of times say, oh, that person lost their temper. Very reactive, fight, flight, or freeze kind of reaction. And then there's something called proactive violence, which is getting to targeted violence. And so when we think about a student who may be thinking about targeted violence towards someone else, sometimes what gets coupled in with that is they might engage in a violent or aggressive act towards someone else and then harm themselves or want to die by suicide, or towards maybe a community, or maybe, it's some people in the school community. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about targeted violence. So what are some of the warning signs of that, or how do children arrive at that place? Most typically, the types of grievances that start children toward this pathway, thinking about harming others, perhaps themselves too, most typically begins with interpersonal kinds of grievances, most commonly grievances where perhaps they've had some sort of argument with a friend. Maybe they felt humiliated because they're being rejected by someone that they're interested in romantically, or maybe they're being rejected by a peer group. Maybe they're being made fun of. Maybe they're the new student in your school, or they're the student who just doesn't seem hasn't figured out how to quite connect with a group of friends or even one friend. And so we see those types of grievances, and the other types of grievance that are most common for children and adolescents in schools who are thinking about targeted violences are grievances with us as educators. And a lot of times that starts with, again, when students might feel slighted, especially when they feel humiliated, when they might feel like they were called out in front of class, or maybe an administrator had to discipline them in a way that really leaned into some type of humiliation. We often can see those kinds of things. And then there are other types of grievances that are starting to show up more commonly with children who are thinking about violence. And one of those groups of grievances are what we call ideological kinds of grievances. And what I mean by ideological grievances are children who have all the same kinds of ideological grievances that adults do. Sometimes they're political in nature, sometimes they're environmental in nature, sometimes they are racist in nature. This is where you start thinking about phobias and isms, any of those kinds of things, where they might be thinking about that. And when we start seeing the warning signs for that, what we typically see are students who are starting to talk more and more about things that might make us uncomfortable. They might be doing a lot of research. It might show up in our keyword searches that come up when we're looking at what are they searching when they're in a school. They might be changing their appearances to emulate people that they are venerating or putting sort of up on a pedestal, who are leading or seen as leaders in that ideological grievance space. And many times the warning signs look much like what someone might look like if they're thinking about suicide too, which is they might be more isolative. They might be their ability to emotional regulate might look differently. They might seem angrier more often, or they might be withdrawn more often. They might be isolating. And then really ultimately, just like the trend that we see where children and adolescents especially are using social media, are using texting, or using apps for something we specifically call in the behavior threat assessment field to leak out that they're actually thinking about an act of violence. All of these things go together as warning signs of students who are thinking about engaging in targeted violence.
Well, you two have touched base on so many of the questions that I had walking into this conversation today, particularly looking at, what is that fine line between typical teen concerns and often silent cries for help? And I think even in looking at, as the adults in the room, what is a meaningful or appropriate reaction versus to overreaction to a situation. Similar to both of you, I have always been under the same belief. It's always best protocol to report rather than leave something, left in the air and have, a student that potentially could be crying out for help. And that student might not even realize that they are. So if we're looking at these systems of support that we have and structures like our SAP teams, what are the most effective systems and structures in addition to SAP, but for, our counselors, safety officers, admin, to really stay in sync when it comes to student mental health? And how can these be best supported, or where can administrative team members reach out to bring in the individuals to really help, maintain and continuously train and bring awareness?
Susan, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I needed a minute.
Lengthy delay.
Yeah, that's one of those places we can edit out. I think that if we, your question is just so rich. There's so many directions to take it. First of all, I'm going to say, let's make sure that our staff know how to interact with kids around some of these difficult conversations. We used to call them courageous conversations. I think that really requires that an educator have the knowledge base that comes through a training like Youth Mental Health First Aid or even a SAP training to be able to understand that these are brain illnesses. They are not willful misbehaviors. And so how do I ask rather than assume? Let students know that you're concerned and you're not judging, that you don't have to have the right words. And you want to normalize help seeking, that it's okay to ask for help, because these are big challenges, and a real sign of strength is the ability to reach out and say, I need some help, and I'm going to help you find it, and we won't give up trying to find it together. I think when you are looking for systems to relate to, one place to go is really the Student Assistance Program Liaison that comes in from the county. These people have very strong behavioral health training. They are very aware of the resources in the community that could be helpful to students. I think that, and any of our mental health staff that are available, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, they are available for consultation. I think we always have to trust our gut. We have to document patterns, that it isn't just one bad day, but you're looking for consistent escalation. And don't wait for kids to ask for help. Many times they won't. So you want to find ways to help bridge that and bring kids together with those necessary and really helpful people that live in our schools. So those are my thoughts. Melissa?
So a few other people within the systems that help support those structures and systems internal to schools are our school nurses. They have a background, they take, they have training in understanding child and adolescent mental health. That's part of their credentialing, their certificating. And we never want to forget or leave out of the conversation school nurses. They are some of the best noticers of changes in behavior. They often have some of the most impactful, important relationships with students who are struggling, because many students who are struggling with mental health needs end up going to the nurse's office a lot during the course of a day. And they notice changes in students before many of us notice changes in students. So we certainly want to also include in that mix of the helpers in the schools, and what I even consider to be some of the most important mental health experts in the school to be school nurses. So I think about those kind of folks internally. I think about other really great relationship builders and noticers of change in behavior, or something's going on. I may not know exactly what it is, but people like our front office staff who interact with families every day, all day long, whether it's on the phone or whether, people are coming into the office. They were the people who really we should be stopping by and saying, hey, anything coming to mind as far as, a child who's seems to be coming in late every day that might be slipping off my radar, or, family calling in at a time of distress and telling you something that might be helpful for us to know so that we can be addressing that. People like the custodians in the school and the bus drivers, they're all part of this support system that spend time with children in our less structured times, when children in some ways show what's really going on in those spaces. And families are often very willing to share things with folks like that. So there's that. And then externally we can never forget about what supports good mental health in children is making sure we have the very best types of relationships that we can with the caregivers of children, their families, however that family is defined, whether it's a mother, a father, an aunt, an uncle, a child who maybe is in foster care, making sure that we are spending a tremendous amount of time with the members of our student support teams, and making sure like families feel like they can sit down at a table and they understand that it is part of the cultural expectations that family belong at the table with us when it comes to supporting the mental health concerns of children, and that they leave having, even in the worst of moments, the ability to feel like they are seen and heard and we value their opinions.
If we focus on safety for just a few more minutes, I think one of the big questions that I always have in building these positive school climates and cultures within our districts, when it comes to safety, how can we move away from fear-based environments and instead build a sense of trust between educators, students, and security staff? And I'm thinking too, even with many of our older students, they know that their teachers are mandated reporters, so they might be a little hesitant to even express some of the concerns that they have for themselves. So really, how do we navigate this shift?
So when we're being really honest about how we think about safety and security in schools, its evolution, the history of its evolution, we can see that we've gone through ebbs and flows of time of who is leading those conversations. There were times when, initially those conversations were very much law enforcement led, first responder led. Then there were times where it was completely educator led. Sprinkled in there from time to time might be climate surveys where we're asking children how they feel, where we're asking families how they feel. If we really want to get to the place that I would consider best practices, evidence-based, from school safety to school security, we need to have a round table where all of the stakeholders, whether it be the educators within the buildings, law enforcement either within or external to the building, or other first responders and families, people need to have an equal voice at the table to ensure that all experiences and all perspectives are being considered. That helps there be a level of vulnerability, and it also is a level of transparency where people feel less fearful because of the unknown. They don't really know what's going on, or they don't feel like they have a say in what's going on, towards a place of more efficacy, of feeling like, hey, we really can create a place where people feel safe and secure because everybody feels like they have a say and everybody has skills to help create a more safe and secure skills. Everything from educators and families better understanding things like we're talking about in the podcast, warning signs of suicide, warning signs that a child might be struggling with thinking about an act of aggression or violence, and teaching and training people within school systems and families about those things, to children being better aware of how they can support their own good mental health, to really listening to the expertise that law enforcement and other first responders can bring to the table. So really, in my mind, what this all comes down to is having that round table where we bring everybody who's involved in creating a safe and secure school together, and everybody has a seat at the table. Everyone has an equal voice at the table, and we figure out how to really truly balance all of those perspectives. That's when I see the most mature, best functioning school districts that are out there, is when that particular practice is happening.
So this is my last question for you today. If you could change just one thing in the current educational system to better support student mental health and safety, what would it be and why?
I want all educators to work at shifting, because we came up in education. Many of us have our own scars from different educators that negatively influenced us. And I think one thing that has the potential to really shift the climate and culture of a school is doing some deep diving into the trauma-informed mindset. So we're viewing students as whole people that have lives outside of our classrooms, rather than focusing on just academic performance. Still, so many educators believe that the way to deal with challenging behaviors is through pain and punishment. And it's my experience that behaviors don't change, especially the behaviors of kids who are struggling with behavioral health issues. They don't change when we create shame and pain. Consequences teach. And that's, I think, what good discipline does. I think using language that everyone can understand, being able to, as Melissa said, recognize we don't have the answer, but together we can build a response or a solution. And that means the family, the student themselves. I think moving away from zero tolerance policies and really understanding that, we need to have restorative conversations and figure out how to repair. So I think it's that shift from that traditional view that a student is uncontrollable, get them out of my classroom, to that student's having difficulty regulating their brain right now. They might have been activated, and my job as a teacher, just as it is, to teach spelling, is also to teach kids about the brain and how to manage it better.
Well, Shannon, you said one thing to change. So that's hard, because I've heard Susan and you talk about so many ways we can improve our systems around safety and security. But I'll answer the question using the old adage, the change I'd like to see begins with me. And I think if everyone who's involved in a school system, from students to educators to families to first responders to law enforcement to community mental health providers, use that in a focused way, then we can start looking to each other to use the strengths of all of the people involved in the system. I am so proud of the fact that largely this work is really taking hold in Pennsylvania. This change is happening. The Commonwealth is really becoming a leader in the country as far as how do we address this evolution of making schools more safe and secure. When I think about everything from the legislators who have crafted bills like Act 71 since 2014 around suicide awareness, prevention, intervention, and postvention, to Act 18, where we get into what Susan's talking about, which is being more trauma informed, to acts that oversee good behavioral threat assessment, to the current Act 55 that requires all school employees to know more. And starting this summer, by the way, requires that all educational institutions that provide a certificating program for educators, whether it's undergraduate, master's, or doctorate, that they too have a minimum of 3 credit hours in topics like trauma-informed practices, behavioral health awareness, suicide and bullying awareness and prevention. This work is happening so much, and it started with individuals looking at themselves, the me in this, and it's taking hold, and it's flowers that are blossoming across this entire state that actually are becoming the change we want to see. So to everything that Susan said, and at every level, from child the whole way up to university preparation programs, the change I'd like to see is already evolving. So I have great hope for the Commonwealth and every single child in whatever school district that they're in the state, whatever school entity that they're in, that the adults inside of the buildings are going to be able to get better and better, iteratively better, a little bit better every day at supporting their mental health needs.
And there you have it, everyone. That's our honest deep dive into what it really takes to move towards prevention, support mental health, and create schools where every student feels seen, safe, and supported. So if there's one message to walk away with, it's this. Prevention isn't passive, it's active. And noticing the quiet shifts in students' posture, listening closely to what is not being said, and making space for students and staff to be mentally well. We can't build safe schools for kids without mentally healthy adults guiding them. We heard it loud and clear. We need systems, not silos. Consistency, not just crisis response. And we need to shift from asking, what's wrong with this student, to what does this student need from us right now? Real change starts with clarity, courage, and connection amongst educators, mental health professionals, mental health teams, school safety personnel, and even the students themselves. So thanks for listening. And remember, a safe, supportive school climate doesn't come from policies alone. It grows from the people who believe in it enough to act. Melissa and Susan, once again, thank you so much for joining in on the conversation today. And for those of you that in the audience, thanks for listening to Lesson Learned, the official podcast of the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Department in Midwestern Intermediate 4. Until next time, continue to educate, innovate, and inspire. We'll see you soon.